Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Okay, hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is December 30th, Thursday, in fact. December 30th. Not the other December 30th you were thinking of. Duh. But Thursday, December 30th, 2021. I mean, come on. Yeah, I should write one of those headlines like the December 30th you didn't think you... All right, anyway. Ready to roll today? Well, not exactly, I guess. But, Oh, look. Okay. Thanks very much. Bruce McFarlane, who follows us along and on Twitter and elsewhere, notes from yesterday's program that, let's see, who is this that he's retweeting? Is a blue checkmark type person. So maybe we can check in and see. Harry Kunzru. Do I have that right? Harry as in Hari. Anyway, oh, look, a novelist at that. Okay, very interesting. And he says... So the Comet movie, which I guess by which he means Don't Look Up, is quite a good pandemic movie. And that's interesting. Although now it strikes me as, Bruce was saying, say you're not alone. You saw it as a pandemic commentary more so than a climate change commentary. Now, of course, it strikes me that these days this is something that people say about, I meant it's a good movie to watch during the pandemic when you're stuck at home. Not that I view it as a pandemic, but I do. I view it that way. Oh, let's see what Harry means. Does anybody answer him? I mean, nobody acknowledges that it. There's lots of people who say, no, it wasn't. Just flatly. All right. Well, I don't know. It's getting pretty roundly panned. But anyway, I don't know. I enjoyed it, and it's all over now. I don't know that it's going to become a cult classic for me or anything, but I thought it was okay. And but no acknowledgement that they too agree that it's a movie more about the pandemic and pandemic response than about climate change response. And that's probably just because it's not. And I am insisting on well, you know what? If you can impose a framework on the film for yourself that makes it more enjoyable, go do it. You don't owe it to anybody to view it the way they do. So... I don't know what that means. Screw you. Everybody shut up. I had a good time with it, and you can't change it. It's too late. I've already spent the time. Anyway, as a matter of fact, speaking of spending time, the Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now. I'm spending your time now, and I should be more careful with it. Kagro X, Bill tells us, reminds you that it's not New Year's Eve yet. I know, it's taking forever. So put your clothes back on and grow up. Okay. Sure, that's fine advice. I mean... Any time is a good time to grow up, I suppose. I don't know what clothes have to do with it, but if you're not wearing any, it's okay. It's radio. So do what you like. Let's see. Mighty OCD has a comment this morning. What do we have here? He says about the movie, the terrible movie that everybody hated. I saw it as a perfect commentary of what would happen if a comet were coming to destroy the Earth. Well, that's a very literal reading of it. That's true. And as you know, you can't pass a literature class just telling us what was in the book. So that's obviously totally wrong. We'll have to throw that one out. Okay, let's see. Many things to catch up with today. Greg Dworkin working diligently to put a raft of stories together, as usual. Big news for today is that someone whose name I don't really know how to pronounce was found guilty in the sex trafficking case arising out of, I guess, the entirety of Jeffrey Epstein's life. I did hear someone of authority pronounce her name. I heard it yesterday, though. This was done earlier. Just an old press conference from one of the top, one of the chief first to speak out victims of their abuse, whose name I'm not sure I can pronounce, but who I guess back then was known as Virginia Giuffre or something quite close to that. She's goes by a different surname these days, but I guess she just keeps being identified that way because that's how she's identified in most of the paperwork from when she was younger. And she pronounces the name something close to the pronunciation of Jillian, which I guess I guess we'll take as authoritative. She knew her and knows her still, and knows, I guess, how people around her pronounce that name. I think I've been schooled in it before and have already forgotten. But Ghislaine Maxwell, now guilty, I think, on almost every count. I keep seeing numbers being thrown around, but mostly I'm confused by the jokes being made about it, like somebody saying, I think so she was guilty on 4 out of 5 counts or something like that, and people would write it out as 4/5 counts, and then somebody wrote the joke, a very, quite brilliant joke about Dave Brubeck being guilty on 5/4 counts, and it's a written joke, and it doesn't work quite as well, but you get the idea. Now it's got me confused about the numbers, but guilty is the part we have to be concerned about here, and, well, gosh, that's great news. So, anyway, we'll catch up with that, what it might mean, and it's very interesting. There's been a reaction from, well, some of the dumbest people in the world. For instance, Marjorie Trader Green and Lauren Boebert, who apparently are convinced that this spells doom for, well, that there are many names on what we would used to say was both sides of the aisle who could potentially be embroiled in anything, any conflict, any controversy or illegality, for that matter, that would come to light if the books got opened on the Ghislaine Maxwell case and all that she knows. And now that she has been found guilty and faces sentencing, I guess there's some possibility that she may cooperate in some way to try to avoid the harshest possible sentences, although I really don't think she's going to have great luck avoiding harsh sentences. But maybe she'll spill the beans on the famous people that Jeffrey Epstein palled around with. The whole plan, of course, at the time being, if I pal around with these famous and powerful people, I will escape justice. And, all of that has not really panned out all that well for them. But anyway, Boebert and Green are convinced, of course, that this is bad news and only bad news for the Democrats who will be embroiled in this controversy, and have tweeted as much. Marjorie Trader Green tweeting, Jeffrey Epstein's entire network should be made public and his fortune should go to his victims. That's all pretty good. If the fake J6 committee, she has to tie it into this, if the fake January 6th committee can subpoena innocent people's cell phone data, they're not innocent, and bank records, then Jeffrey Epstein's whole network should be publicized, which is a thing that you could do if you served on any committees, but you don't. And Lauren Boebert tweeting that Ghislaine Maxwell deserves to rot behind bars for the rest of her days, and the public deserves to know every single person involved in the Epstein sex trafficking network. We deserve to know the whole truth, not just some vague court sketches, which is a little bit odd. But then I note the tweet of Wu-Tang is for the children, who says, I have a feeling that Dumb and Dumber will be getting angry phone calls from a Florida country club soon, telling them to STFU. Maybe, maybe not, although, he lives in denial, too. He might also believe that only the bad stuff about Democrats will come out, and I will go scot-free, and his life experience says he's got reason to believe as much. All right, time now to recognize that Greg Dworkin is here and let him speak, and then that's the end of my speaking till about 10 o'clock. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
That's the plan.
Right.
So, there's a huge scandal associated with Ghislaine Maxwell.
No.
And no, it's not the one about her being guilty on 5 of 6 counts.
Thank you.
And the count that she wasn't found guilty on has to do with a single individual as to whether or not this individual was enticed. But the same individual got another conviction for a slightly different wording of the charge. So I'm not a lawyer and I don't understand the differences, but guilty is basically the headline. Okay, so that's not a scandal. That's justice. But the scandal is that the BBC, the staid BBC, staid conservative BBC decided that they were going to cover this trial.
Yeah.
And so who do they have on as their legal expert?
I know the answer.
You do?
Yeah. But you can tell the answer if you want.
No, you tell it.
Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz.
So they had Alan Dershowitz on.
Who might be that other individual.
That would be the very same Alan Dershowitz that's been accused of sexual abuse by Virginia Roberts.
Roberts, that's
Goffrey.
Yes.
However that's pronounced.
Yeah, I don't know.
She's
Roberts
also, of course, accused of Prince Andrew.
Yes.
And the reason that stuff didn't come out at trial is that it was not germane to the specific charges.
Yeah, right. I did see about that, and everyone was quite upset about that. Apparently, BBC among them.
But BBC said, wait a minute. This guy who's involved in this is here commenting on the propriety of the verdict?
Yeah, it's totally, I don't know. I wonder what he said about it. But at any rate, he said, well,
let's have Donald Trump on CNN to talk about the propriety of January 6th committee getting together and looking into his stuff, because he's like a totally objective.
Yes. Well, you laugh, but they will.
Quite counterpoint.
They will actually have him on there at some point.
Yeah, we'll have Steve Bannon and Donald Trump for balance.
Mm-hmm. Right, so they can all talk about it from all angles. Yes, that's true. I did see that they issued a statement saying, hey, yeah, that was wrong of us.
Well, here's the headline from the Times of London. It's not the Times of London anymore. It's just the Times. And by the way, I could read the story because, oh my goodness, I seem to have a subscription to this thing. BBC launches investigation into interview with lawyer implicated in Ghislaine Maxwell case. Alan Dershowitz has been accused of sexual abuse by Virginia Roberts Joffrey.
Yeah.
The BBC has launched an investigation after admitting that an interview breached its editorial standards.
Yes, it did.
The Harvard professor was introduced as, quote, a constitutional lawyer, and, quote, with no reference made to his involvement in the case or previous representation of Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah.
The BBC also failed to make clear that Dershowitz, 83, has been accused of sexual abuse by the same woman who has alleged similar charges against Prince Andrew. Both men deny the charges. They didn't get a statement from Buckingham Palace that said, I don't see the problem.
Yeah, well, they won't get that. But, yeah, BBC recognizes it. But, yeah, everybody justifiably mad. I did see that, although apparently also Fox News has no problem using him for the same
but they had
purpose.
Something
Right?
Well, this is cute. The BBC newsroom is unlikely to have been at full strength during Christmas, hit by COVID, meaning it's possible more junior members of the staff may have been responsible. So BBC is currently looking for an intern to blame, and we will report back to you as soon as we find one.
Okay. Well, that's it. Yeah.
One insider said, and it's a quote, the cuts have stripped the newsroom of the necessary experience to stop the screw-ups.
Huh. All right. I know.
All right. So there you go. So
COVID-19
has effects that you don't even think about.
Right. Right. You didn't realize it was responsible for putting Alan Dershowitz on the air. Well, that is weird. At least they feel
is responsible for Alan Dershowitz, and it says so right here in the Times.
Oh. Well, get vaccinated,
Times
everybody.
of London, and it didn't exactly say that, but hey, this is Twitter, and this is good for clicks.
Yeah. Well, I would agree, and right, it's a good reason as any to get your vaccine, if that will keep Alan
but
Dershowitz
also to read the
air.
entire story and not just the headlines.
Oh, well, I don't have time for that. All right.
Yep.
What else have we got?
Well, we got a couple. Do you want to go with January 6th, or do you want to go with the pandemic? Those are the two big stories.
Wow. Let's see. Let's do January 6th first today.
Okay, let's do January 6th.
It's almost January 6th.
So this is a follow-up to a story that we carefully covered, which is to say we read somebody else's work.
Right. But carefully.
Breaking, says Spiro Agnews Ghost, tweeting, an emergency request last week from Donald Trump's spokesperson, Taylor Budowich, to block a subpoena of his bank records. Remember we covered that?
Oh, right, yes. Mm-hmm.
Was denied by a federal judge on Wednesday as moot.
Okay.
Apparently the records had already been turned over.
Well,
I mean, the thing I like about it is just the incompetence of it, but also the whole idea of, I'll give you everything you asked for. Here is my third grade book report. What, you want my bank accounts? Wait a minute. I'm not
Why did I do that? Yeah, well, okay, so moot. I like that. Good, all right, they're not doing very well over there.
Well, wait a minute. What do you mean it's moot? Why don't we just sell it? We'll settle this in moot court. I'll appeal.
Unmoot it, then.
Unmoot it. Let's go to the moot.
Yeah, right. See, the interesting thing was, it wasn't even that it was mooted. They were having the hearing on Zoom, and he was blabbing, and the judge was like, "You're muted. You're muted."
So we'll go to mute court.
Never mind. Right? Okay.
I covered mute court in law school, I think, some years ago. At least I think that's what they called it by my memory.
Yeah. Well, all right. Look, as long as he's lost, that's Good news. I don't really care why.
There's some other people that should
the
lose.
law doesn't matter.
So this is from Axios.
Oh.
Trump accuses January 6th panel
He's wrong.
of seeking evidence of criminal activity. I
Wait,
mean, you know,
that deserves-
irony is so dead you can't even,
I know.
drown it in a bathtub.
That's gotta
Need that
Oh my
music
God.
for it.
So,
Former
all right.
President Trump's legal team on Wednesday accused the House committee investigating the Capitol riot
Yeah.
of seeking to uncover evidence that would support a criminal referral against him. Remember we were talking about why it would be a bad idea to do that?
Yeah. But I'm
Or
not
a
sure
good
it
idea
is.
to do that?
We definitely talked about the idea of it.
We talked about the idea of doing that, but apparently Trump has realized that this is a concept.
Wow.
So Axios says why it matters. The brief asked the Supreme Court to consider Committee Chair Benny Thompson's interview with the Washington Post as part of its effort to block the release of records because they're just trying to get me, basically is what he's saying. How dare they?
Well, what are you going to do?
And so, with the Supreme Court, this is what you're going to do. So today,
This court, yes.
because that was filed yesterday, the Select Committee is expected to file a response to the request to the Supreme Court on Thursday. That's today.
Yes, this is a demurrer, I think.
So, and then the Supreme Court gets to decide. The Supreme Court has a lot of things to do. They have to decide or to
Maybe they need
decide
more
not
help.
to decide about a bunch of things, including the OSHA mandates. But that's to be
OSHA, right,
discussed
okay.
on January 7th.
Like the ocean mandates. What are we doing now?
Yeah.
OSHA.
So the ocean is going to tell you that you can't do this or do that because,
That's right.
because
yeah.
the rising tide lifts all boats.
That could be. That's really on the moon more than the ocean. The ocean is just
Right.
the medium.
Speaking about Don't Look Up as a pandemic movie,
Yeah, let's.
you could,
Recently on
I suppose, squint and say, okay, the Meryl Streep presidential figure was obviously Donald Trump. And then the scientist trying
she
to
was
come
a
in and
Democrat.
say, we're all going to die because of this natural event that's happening was Nancy Messonnier and from CDC. And then, you could do this and you could do that. The problem with the movie is it just wasn't that funny. But, can you look at it that way? Sure, you could look at it that way. And there's plenty to look at when it comes to the pandemic in regard to how the government is responding. But the funny thing is, the government is actually responding in like a normal manner. We'll get to that. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. And, of course, they'll be pilloried for it. But the fact is they're being a little realistic for a change. So anyway, Trump isn't. He wants the Supreme Court to shut down the January 6th panel. And while this is going on, Nicholas Riccardi, who's a pretty straight reporter who reports in the Midwest for AP, says slow motion insurrection, how GOP seizes election power.
Yes.
And he's looking at the individual states. And basically because Trump failed at what he tried to do on January 6th, this is how the GOP is trying to put people in place who would agree with what Peter Navarro, that you talked about on the show yesterday, and others were trying to do.
Yes.
So by putting the people at the state level into place that say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, that's how they're trying to set up the next one.
Mm-hmm. The people and the law. They are not only replacing their secretaries of state who will do what Brad Raffensperger wouldn't, but they are changing the laws, even in Georgia as we speak, so that people like Brad Raffensperger could feel justified next time, even if they don't lose, in doing what Donald Trump asked. I still feel that a fair reading of Raffensperger's responses in the phone call and elsewhere indicate that he felt constrained by the law more so than he felt like it was just morally the wrong thing to do to help Trump. And he would have helped him if he felt like the law was on his side. And now it will
But
be.
it wasn't, so he didn't. And
Right.
that wasn't good enough, of course, for the Trumpers. So they want people in place that simply ignore that sort of thing. So they
Right.
want the Marjorie
If they can't
Trader
change
Green
the
types
law, they'll
to
take
be
the
in those
people.
positions.
Right.
And the thing is, it's really simple. Because what happened is Biden got more votes in places like Georgia than Trump did. And so the Republicans responded by saying, well, what do you mean by votes?
Right.
What's a vote anyway?
Yeah.
We'll decide what a vote is,
You
at least
won't
next
have
time,
more
because
if
we'll have enough
you count
people
the right way.
to vote that we get to decide what the vote is.
Yes. There are a number of choke points that you can do things like that, and they're trying all of them.
Yeah, and they're doing it at a state level because it's a little bit more invisible than trying to do it at
Yes.
at the federal level. So
True,
they figure
right.
if they do it under the radar, they might be able to get away with it. And there are people that are kind of spoiling that a little bit. Brad Raffensperger, because he's been pilloried by the Trump side so visibly. Warnock for winning, and Ossoff for winning in Georgia. That sort of spoils it a little bit for them. Ben Winkler working very hard in Wisconsin.
Right.
To make sure that the Wisconsin people don't get away with that. Folks in Michigan, folks in Ohio, David Pepper, So there are people that are working on this, which leads me to my next piece here, which is,
all right.
I thought, really interesting. From Julia Azari, political scientist,
Yes.
who writes in the New York Times, "Are Democrats bad at politics?"
That's a good question.
With a very surprising answer.
I don't know what's going to surprise me. I can't decide which one. All right. Let's hear it.
After the latest twist by Manchin in the Build Back Better drama, Democrats are weathering a storm of accusations of being plain bad at politics, and that's nothing new. As a party of representing many groups, Democrats have always struggled to nail down party priorities and deliver on their campaign promises. But what's new is for the Biden administration, the challenges have been compounded by a very narrow majority, nationalized politics, and new ideological currents. So it's hard. You have to figure out, who to represent.
Yeah.
I mean, you could just open your social media and get a clear idea of that.
Sure.
What Biden needs to do really is get rid of student loans. No, he's got to concentrate on climate, like that movie that we were just watching. No, he's really got to concentrate on, making sure that democracy is preserved, as we were just talking about. No, it's really all about making sure that people can vote, and he's just not spending enough time.
Yes.
Those are all true.
Right.
They're all true.
And they're all.
So what coalition is going to agree that they're all true and we're on board with everything you try to do, knowing that your issue may be one and mine might merely be number two, very close behind it?
Yeah. That's
right. So she writes, this combination of the old and new Democratic parties left the Biden coalition in a holding pattern. What might look at first like problems with individual politicians is in fact structural problems at once, several. Countermajority in institutions in American government. That is to say, it's the Senate because the Senate doesn't function. The fuzzy balance of power among different forces within the party, and the difficulty of energizing a diverse set of interests around common goals. Negotiating with pivotal senators who are more conservative than much of the rest of the party isn't new. Happened all the time under the New Deal. Nationalized party politics make it more difficult for those senators to cultivate a local personal brand, and as a result, they have to work harder to draw media attention to their performance of political independence and willingness to push back against the president, because it's harder for them to distance themselves. They're harder to negotiate with, which is a really interesting point.
Okay.
So the second change is the emergence of a strong and cohesive left wing within the Democratic Party. The presidential candidacies of Sanders and Warren showed that there's solid support for moving to the left on economic issues, even if it's not a majority of the Democratic coalition. And the Biden coalition also features tensions between the new progressive faction and more traditional liberals represented by members like Speaker Pelosi. So it's likely that a smaller patchwork Democratic coalition is here to stay for a while, and that means they'll still face some of the same problems Roosevelt and Johnson did, but without a key tool for getting things done, large majorities.
All right.
So in other words, Johnson and Roosevelt lost a lot of Democrats. It didn't matter because they had extra votes in their pocket, which made, of course, them look like geniuses. And Biden has got no votes in his pocket in the Senate and 4 votes in the House, which makes Pelosi look like a genius, but not Schumer. But that's the way it works.
Yeah.
I added that last part, but it's true.
Well, good ad then.
Okay. The other, which has drawn the most attention in the past year, though little progress, is institutional reform. The approach isn't so much about enlarging the Democratic coalition as it is about reforming the rules of governance to allow a party that already wins national elections to wield proportionate influence.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Proposals include filibuster reform, making Congress more proportional. Proponents argue these changes would ease the veto power that less populated, more conservative areas of the country hold over the majority, and so therefore, I would add that's why it won't happen.
Yeah, well, okay. For now.
Finally, the party could scale back on its policy agenda, but recent history suggests that change candidates like Obama and Sanders and Trump resonate with an electorate that craves change, even if they can't agree on what kind. So, long and the short of it, many of the Democratic many of the Democrats' problems in the legislative process aren't of their own making. But fairly or not, of course, everybody will hold them responsible.
Yeah, well,
I thought that was pretty good summary of what's going on here.
I think so. That's that does sum it up. And I've been thinking a lot about traditional political science these days. As I was thinking about what you mentioned about the BBC. I saw Armando discussing just panning them again earlier today, and it got me thinking about the way everyone was on the BBC's case, of course, about having him on Dershowitz, but no one saying anything, of course, about Fox having him on. And it reminded me kind of like of the Joe Manchin thing. Oh, he's the one holding up all these bills, without pointing out, well, he's only able to hold up all these bills because every single Republican also will not do the right thing, and we forget about that. Same thing, I don't know, it felt similar to me, like, of course Fox is going to do this.
Nobody holds Fox to standards because it's Fox.
Right. So a little bit like that. The only hope we have of moving anybody by pressure and shame would be to talk to perhaps a real journalism outfit or a Democratic politician, even though people have their problems with them. But you're not going to move a Republican. Nobody calls Shelley Moore Capito and says, this is good for West Virginia. What are you doing?
Right. Or Romney or Murkowski or Collins and say, look, the three of you could get together and decide the balance of the Senate if you wanted to. What's going on? Why aren't you?
I don't know. Well, they're deeply concerned, though. I do know that.
Instead we turn to Fox News.
Yeah.
We decide you comport.
It's a little bit like that, I feel like. And it's like everything else, too, right? Like, there's no more political science. Only one party. Like regular science, nobody in the Republican Party recognizes political science either anymore. Consent to the governed? What's that mean? We can redefine what consent means and what governed means. So what's the point? I don't know.
Pandemic after the break.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com.
That'll be a topic that we'll discuss.
In fact, we can discuss it now. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back now. Greg and I are returning to the show a little bit early. That's fine. We're getting ready. We're raring to go on the pandemic. So
So this is Bob Wachter. I want to give you some good news along with the bad news.
What?
And Bob Wachter, who's a UCSF internal medicine chief. I think he's chair of the department there.
Not Judge Wapner.
I suppose I could look up and see exactly what he is, but
he'll tell you.
He's a big deal in San Francisco medicine circles, and says, my latest tweets have been mostly bad news, which saddens me, particularly during the holiday season, but today I'll take you to my happy place.
Bob Ross.
Fraggle Rock, okay. I guess. I don't know.
All right. Not Wapner, Wachter. All right.
Wachter.
Judge
With
Wapner.
Some thoughts on why we could be in good shape and maybe even great shape in just 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start by agreeing that the current state's awful and likely to get worse. Case rates are skyrocketing. Hospitalizations are going up fast, but not nearly as fast as cases. And it feels like everybody's infected or recently exposed, and there are shortages of key tools, including testing, therapies, and that's part of why CDC did what they did, by the way. But there are some positive trends peeking out from behind the fog of gloom, so let's explore them.
All right.
First,
what are they?
The case hospitalization dissociation is pretty solid. Cases are going up faster than hospitalizations are, even though hospitalizations are going up.
All right.
Omicron's relative mildness, and that's relative. Relative mildness doesn't mean mild. If you feel
Oh,
like
I
you got
see.
hit by a truck because it feels like you had the flu, that's not great.
Right.
Omicron's relative mildness is both due to inherent properties of the virus, increasingly shown through animal studies and epidemiologic data, and the fact that high levels of vaccine-induced immunity, while less protective versus mild COVID, are quite protective against severe cases. So that is to say, the virus seems to stick to your nose a lot, which is why it's so infectious. Your bronchi, which isn't great, which makes you cough your brains out, and your throat, which makes you have a very sore throat, but not so much in your lungs, and so you don't get pneumonia.
Yes,
That
don't
they
get dead.
get far down as the alveoli. So
Good.
that's good. And so you don't feel good, and you go to the hospital, or you want to know if you have COVID, and you go to the hospital because that's the only place you can get tested. And you have the worried well, you have the mildly sick, you have the moderately sick, you have the severe sick, you have, I don't even have COVID, but I have to go to the hospital because I just, crashed my car into a tree sick. And so you got a lot of people in the hospital. And sadly,
Yes.
he says, unvaxxed are sitting ducks, wholly dependent on inherent mildness of the variant, which will protect them a little, but not a lot. But the vaccine boosted should feel pretty good about their odds. So if you're vaccinated and boosted and you get COVID, chances are, all things being equal, you won't be nearly as sick as Delta would have made you, and that's good. And you won't be nearly as sick as those who are unvaccinated, because depending upon what hospital you look at, between 3/4 and 90% of the people winding up in the hospital are unvaccinated. Now, why they don't get vaccinated is an issue, but the fact is they're not. And again, that's what CDC is dealing with. This means that those hospitalized for COVID are mostly those who have made a bad choice to remain unvaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
They deserve our compassion and care. In my experience, they're getting it. He is a doctor in a hospital who
Deserve his.
grant all he wants to and get mad at them, but he's still going to treat them.
All right.
But it was a choice for which they should have appreciated the risks. I mean, we've told them enough times on the show why they don't listen to the show. It's not my fault or yours. So with Omicron, this infectious, many vaxxed people will get mild breakthrough cases, which would leave them even more protected against another infection. Because who knows down the road, which variant we get.
Okay. I hope that's the end of the variants.
C variant, with all those people out. And virtually all unvaxxed people, unless they're being uber careful, will get infected shortly. Because it's just like, this is really infectious. It's a beast. So most of the unvaxxed who get COVID will get lucky and have a relatively mild case. Others will have a more serious case but survive. And some will die.
Yes.
In any case, society's overall immunity to Omicron should be far higher in 4 to 6 weeks than it is now.
Because you'll have
Our win in action.
it.
Right? Both from additional people getting vaccinated and the consequences of having had Omicron. We'll have to see how well the case of Omicron protects against recurrence, but I'm hopeful it'll offer some major protection. There are T cells as well as B cells, as well as antibodies. And, so you put them all together, and some things you just can't measure directly. I took a blood test to tell me how immune I am. It doesn't always work that way.
Okay.
We'll have to see how well a case of Omicron protects, and protection may decay over time.
It does great.
May lead to a resurgent threat by winter 2022, which is to say seasonal, which is like the flu, but that's my happy place.
Wow.
So let's stick to the spring.
That's happy.
Now, by late January, I expect 2 of the key bottlenecks will have eased. Testing bottleneck, because the feds are doing, including the military, by the way, they're doing quite a bit in terms of trying to get new test kits out to market and wrapping up free rapid testing. Here in Connecticut, we're starting to offer free tests for people. There was a sign up for my town for Friday, which is tomorrow. Then the state announced that there's going to be a slight delay, so we hope it'll still go on by Friday. But if not, it'll happen by Monday.
That's like a testing event. You go and get tested. They're not handing out free ones.
Yeah, free tests.
Oh, those two. So they're giving out home kits.
Giving out 1 million home kits to
All
Connecticut people and 6 million N95s.
All right. That's great.
And they're doing it through the towns
Infused with
because there's
nutmeg.
no functional county government here in Connecticut.
Oh.
And the
yes,
supply
right.
of Paxlovid, which is the pill, will grow so that the pill is available, at least for high-risk COVID outpatients. But, of course, you need tests to make best use of that. So those things will be in place by mid to late January. And it does look like the pill will work pretty well on Omicron, so we may be in a position where most high-risk patients have strong immunologic protection, plus they have medicine, so that's all good. And vaccine-boosted people who have managed to avoid infection will be protected by falling numbers of cases and reassured by solid evidence that they're quite well protected against severe cases by their Vax Booster combo. Mm-hmm. So you and I are trying to be the vaccine-boosted people who manage to avoid infection, so that will be our happy place too.
Yes.
Now, one final bit of good news.
Yeah.
Adding to the experience in South Africa.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So it's not just South Africa, where cases peaked and began falling after about 2 months. We now may be seeing a rapid plateau in London, one of the hardest hit cities in Europe. As usual, hard to tell how much of this is increased population level immunity versus more careful behavior. I would add it doesn't really matter as long as it goes down.
Is it?
Let's be clear. I'm not in my happy place now, given the potential for overwhelmed hospitals and some ongoing uncertainty re Omicron risk. It's time to be more careful. Sorry, New Year's Eve. And wear N95s. The current threat is very real. Oh, here's another N95 guy.
Okay.
But by early February, we could well be in a place where COVID's in fact like the flu. And I'm sure that my happy place in February, no, there's no guarantee. But these risks feel like fairly low probability events. As dire as things look now, I think the likeliest outcome is a pretty good situation in February.
All right. I hope so.
So at this point, I'm over this. Might not be a sign of exhaustion, confusion, or political affiliation, but a perfectly rational and evidence-based way of approaching COVID and life. But that would be in February, not now. People who say it now are nuts.
Oh, okay.
Or lying to you. Or lying to themselves.
Yeah, that's easy to do. That's true. They could be lying to themselves. It could be someone else's fault that they're lying to themselves, but that's probably what they're doing. All right.
Here's Scott Gottlieb saying, look, there's some indication COVID cases could be starting to peak in London, one of the earliest European cities to become engulfed by Omicron. It's going down in Germany for whatever reason right now. Hospitalizations in the city, while up sharply, are well below levels seen in prior COVID waves and decoupled from the rising cases. And one interesting thing that I happen to notice, New York City does pretty good coverage of what's going on in their city with their departments of health. But the Department of Education has a separate website, and they have a daily COVID case map showing all known interventions and cases of COVID-19 in the New York City public school system.
All right.
Updated Sunday through Friday, so they don't update on Saturdays.
Yeah.
And what they're showing now is confirmed positive COVID cases in the New York City school system as of 6 p.m. yesterday. There were a total of 869 cases, 365 students, 504 staff. Now, if you look at the cumulative positive cases going back from September through December,
okay,
they had 20,000 students and 8,000 staff. So for the most part, they've been running students sick, staff okay. And now that ratio is reversed. Right now, as of yesterday, just looking at yesterday, 504 staff, 365 students. Not overwhelming numbers in a school system as large as New York, which is good. But again, makes the point that some of the things that happen, be it schools, airlines, or hospitals, might in fact happen because of the effect on the staff, not so much on the patients, the students, the passengers. Right? If you have airlines delayed or canceled flights, that's because of staffing issues.
Yes.
If you have hospitals who feel under stress, it might not be that the beds are completely full, but they have staffing issues. If you have issues in the school and the school has to close, it might not be because the students are out, it might be the staff.
Yes.
And so with a very infectious illness that's in your community, this community-based situation is going to drive a lot of what happens. And so that's why what happens in your own community is, in some ways more important than what the media reports from New York City, because the media is based in New York City or Washington.
Yeah. Okay. I can buy that.
That's why when you report about what's going on in Loudoun County, that's important.
Oh, well, as long as
it's local.
Important.
All politics is local.
But,
all COVID is local.
That's true. By the way, speaking of local, I can see very clearly in the daily new case reports on Worldometers the decline in South Africa. I don't see evidence of plateau or decline in UK yet. I don't know what they're talking about. I mean, they know what they're talking about. I don't. But
yeah, that's. I don't know why it's not in Worldometers, but I think one of the things they're looking at is not so much cases,
okay,
but what's going on in the hospitals.
Okay, all right, yeah. Well, the cases are spiking like crazy.
Cases are going to spike, but that decoupling is the important part of it.
Okay, well that's okay. That differentiates. Yeah, the UK plateau is not in terms of cases. They too are breaking records daily.
Everybody's going to break records, but if you stay out of the hospital, that's a unique new thing. Right. It used to be that cases would then 3 weeks predict hospital, which then 3-4 weeks would predict death, but that's broken. That's not what happens now.
All right, we'll see how long it takes to predict death now.
Yeah, still happen. Hospitalization still happens. And the thing is, if you're incredibly tired from doing this for 2 years and you're understaffed anyway, and then you get hit with even a small increase, it's a big deal. And so that's what we're seeing right now. So this is not to minimize it, and it's certainly not to minimize the effect on hospital workers who are having to deal with this right now. They're in a terrible situation. This is just it could always be worse situation. And so it could always be worse, and right now it isn't, but it's still pretty bad the way it is. And that's why a sharp, short spike that we've been talking about, which may happen with Omicron, flash flood rather than tsunami. Flash floods are still pretty bad, and they can do a lot of damage.
If you drown, who cares?
Yeah, who cares, exactly.
Right. Germany's diving, though. I can see the spike finishing in Germany. It's just UK, I can't.
Yeah, not there yet.
Okay.
So, of course, don't forget that nobody measures anything during the holidays.
That's true, too.
It's Boxing Day. We can't do that.
They have an extra holiday. That's just worse. Although you could put your test kit when the results and your report in the mailbox, and it could get picked up. But all right, never mind.
So Tony Fauci was interviewed and said, what's going on here? And he said, basically, CDC is trying to follow the science, and the science is saying that, you're most infectious in the first part of your illness. And so we should recognize that. And by the way, it's just getting so ubiquitous and so all over the place. We basically can't really be strict about everybody. We just can't. And so we won't. And, to a certain extent, that's true. To a certain extent, that's very realistic. I would remind people, during a really bad flu season, you don't test everybody for flu. Mm-hmm. You don't have enough tests to go around, never have. So what happens is the docs start in September testing people who look like they have the flu. And by November or December, when it's clear flu's in the community, they say to people, well, if you feel like you have the flu, you probably have the flu. You don't need to be tested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so if you feel like you have COVID, well, how do you know? It feels like a cold. It feels like the flu. It feels like I didn't get a good night's sleep. How do I know? I want to get tested. That's a problem.
Yeah.
There's not going to be enough tests for that. So that's why going to the emergency room to get tested in that circumstance is not a great idea. If you have fever, that's a different issue. Mm-hmm. So they absolutely positively need to ramp up the home test so people can do that at home if that's what they want to do. Give them that option. Mm-hmm. What Fauci is saying, one of the big problems with the home tests is that they don't guarantee that you're not infectious. A negative test doesn't mean I'm absolutely not infectious. It means I'm probably not infectious.
Okay.
Well, that may be good enough for what's going on right now. Mm-hmm. And so, maybe we should do the home test. But, continuing on that logic, well, if it's probably good enough, then if you just simply, in addition to that, wear a mask for another 5 days, you should be okay. So basically what the CDC guidelines are saying, if you have COVID, if you know you have COVID because you had a test,
you're alive,
then you need to stay isolated for 5 days. Yes. You can come out of isolation if you're no longer sick or your symptoms are resolving. And by that, they mean no fever for 24 hours.
Fever. All right.
Yeah. Then you can come out of isolation and go meet the rest of your humans that you know, but you have to wear a mask.
Okay.
They don't say you should wear an N95. You probably should. But that means you have to be able to get one. And they don't say that you should get a negative test before you go back in society because they don't have enough tests to go around, and they're not convinced that a negative test means you're safe. So they'd rather you wear a mask. Not unreasonable.
Yeah.
But, lots of problems. And the medical people, of course, want clarity, and you can't have clarity here. And the medical people want a decision based on the science, and this is a situation where the politicians are going to have to say, we have to balance a lot of this stuff. So on a CDC webinar, Libby Watson reports, this is, she writes a newsletter on illness and health. This is what a CDC Deputy Director, Christopher Broaden, said a few minutes ago about why the CDC didn't release a science brief along with the new isolation guidelines. This is her best effort transcription. So you will recall that I said the other day, the problem with the CDC is they didn't release why they were doing things at the same time that they released we're doing things.
Okay.
And he said, and I quote, as far as a science brief that we would usually write, it's not going to be the same kind of document. As a science brief that there's new science behind this, therefore we made these changes. Well, there's some information, especially in Omicron. We don't know a lot of that information, so we're really looking to do something that provides more of a rationale rather than a science brief. We're working hard on that to be able to put this in context as to what and why these new recommendations are being proposed. So there isn't any new science.
Okay, well, and that's one reason.
Right? And then here's what Broaden and Lori Hicks said, again from CDC, about why no test to release on day 5. Echoes of what they told the media over the past 24 hours. They argue testing isn't accurate enough to determine the end of isolation. And by the way, we don't have enough tests.
Yeah.
Again, true. They're being transparent. They'll get pilloried for it. But that's actually correct. There aren't enough tests.
Yeah. Well, what are you going to do?
Well, why aren't there enough tests? Well, rather that you not turn to that question, because that would mean you would have had to decide this 6 months ago and you had plenty of time and you didn't. And they're trying to avoid that. But what they're saying is correct.
Okay. That's sciencey enough for me if it's correct.
Well, 3 big questions about the Biden administration's COVID response in 2022 by Lev Thatcher over at Stat News.
Not Lev Parnas.
1. Will the government broaden its focus beyond vaccines? Again, Connecticut is doing home tests plus masks to their residents.
The other thing. There was
2 years into the pandemic, Lev, not Parnas, writes, the U.S. is still laser focused on vaccines and has largely ignored other factors. In particular, Fed regulators haven't done much to incentivize Americans to wear higher quality face coverings. N95s, he whispered.
Yeah,
or to maintain better filtration and cleaner air in indoor spaces. Deep clean the schools. In fact, many of the masks that are still worn today aren't really masks at all, but cloth face coverings that were used as makeshift protection back in early 2020. Still, experts have always known that masks used in medical and industrial settings like surgical mask or N95 and surgical masks do work. They just don't work as well. Are far superior at filtering out infectious particles. Nonetheless, there's no mask requirement to board a train or a plane or to enter a government building. Instead, any face covering will do. Meanwhile, the federal government hasn't done much to improve the quality of air filtration. OSHA hasn't done it. Of course, OSHA is waiting for a bunch of court rulings about what they can and can't do.
Yeah.
So there's that. Number 2, will people who feel sick have better options for test and treatment? We talked about that. That's the happy place for Bob Wachter from San Francisco. Practically, though, right now, both are tough to come by. Rapid tests remain in short supply. They're pricey. Bizarrely, the Biden administration initially scoffed at the idea of making them available for free. Instead, the White House announced a complicated scheme to let people with health insurance pay up front for tests and ask the health plan to pay them back. Eventually, though, the administration announced a plan to buy 500 million COVID rapid tests and mail them for free. The first deliveries won't begin until sometime in January, and it's not clear how many tests will be available immediately. It's not even clear in Connecticut, which is doing its own thing, when the tests will be available immediately, hopefully by tomorrow, but we'll see. Even if people who feel sick do access a rapid test and it comes back positive, they have limited options besides monoclonal antibodies. And there's only one that really works with the Omicron variant, and there's not enough of the pill to go around right now. So that'll get better, but that's a problem for the near future.
Okay.
And number 3, forget a third vaccine. Will Americans need a fourth? We don't know. The Biden administration's late 2021 COVID response was marred by the back-and-forth debate over booster shots, whether they were necessary for everybody, whether the White House interfered with the scientific process of getting them approved. Yes, it was, and no, they didn't. So that's settled.
Okay.
That ship has sailed, especially with the emergence of Omicron. A broad consensus has emerged that adults should be boosted. But let's remind you of the controversy, because that's what we do. I mean,
Teach the
it's
controversy.
unimportant, but I'm going to mention it because why not? Now there's a new looming question. Will Americans need a fourth dose or even additional doses beyond that? Well, we get a flu shot every year. It's not really the issue. Right now, the issue is what do we do right now?
Yeah, I don't like that third one. They should have done a different third big question.
So
Okay.
there's a lot going on, and some people think we'll need a fourth dose, some won't. It doesn't matter. We don't know when. We still haven't checked our T cells yet, so we don't know if that's in fact the case. That one could be put on the back burner. The issue is still tests and upping your mask
Right.
game. And, you know, the other part of that I don't have a specific piece on, although, you know, I don't know if you caught this marvelous New York Times article about why COVID death rates are rising for some groups, the one that shows red areas have more deaths after vaccines are available, and blue areas have less deaths after vaccines are available.
That would be because of people taking the vaccine.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So a lot of things go into that. But people have pointed out, you know, the problem
Yes.
with advocating for things like vaccines and wearing a better mask is it puts the onus of fixing problems, not just the pandemic, you know, climate.
No.
You know, what's your carbon footprint? What kind of car are you driving, et cetera, et
Common
cetera.
impacts.
It puts all the problems of the world on your shoulders. It's up to you to change climate. It's up to you to stop the pandemic.
Yeah.
We, the government, we have nothing to do with it. Don't look at us. We don't fix things. We're the Senate.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, and
guess,
that's a problem.
although...
You know, this is an institutional problem and needs an institutional solution. And it's not on the backs of every individual to do it. And if you don't, it's you who have destroyed the world. You, the scientist who couldn't convince the government that the comet was going to land, you know, it's your fault.
Well, okay. I mean, I don't know how else to...
You shouldn't have said the F word on TV. That's what did it.
Yeah, well, that did it. It ruined it. Your whole communication strategy goes up in flames.
Yeah, then they said you were crazy and nobody listened to you anymore.
Right. But
right?
then she could get
but the fact
job.
is the comet's coming. That's really the salient point, right? Yeah. And so why is it up to a grad student to fix everything? Well, because it's the movies. Right. Well, no, actually, that's what happens in real life too.
Oh, well, that's true to a certain extent. Yeah, it just occurred to me that I'm looking at this map that came along with this, you know, about the vaccine uptake and where cases are up, and it's interesting because as you present it here, the only language that they can accurately present it, they say, well, these are areas where COVID cases or death rates went up, and these are areas where death rates went down after the vaccine became available. I don't know why they can't just come out and say after some people took the vaccine and some people didn't. But I'm thinking now, you know, you got such weird beliefs in some of these places. In some of these reddest areas, they'll say, you see what happened? It was the vaccine that killed everybody. The vaccine became,
It's interesting because, Florida's in bad shape. Kentucky and West Virginia stand out as being in terrible shape.
Yes.
But Texas is split.
Yes.
Right? The west part of Texas is more like New Mexico and in decent shape, and the eastern part of Texas is more like Oklahoma and in pretty bad shape.
Yeah. Well, that's significant. It's a very large state as well.
It's pretty big, yeah.
And there's a lot of room in there, too, by the way. And also out west, I guess, a little less populous. That's also helpful. But if they did get vaccinated, well, I don't know what their vaccine uptake has been, but it's also a little easier to stay in isolation in West Texas.
Right. You can also see that in California, where the Oregon part of California is not in great shape, but the rest of California is in pretty good shape.
That's true. Yeah. Too bad about West Virginia, too, because they were one of the early standouts in vaccine uptake. Well, that was because they were going to the nursing homes and holding people down and saying, here you go. But they jumped out to such a great lead. They were at one point one of the most vaccinated states in the country. And then the rest of the country, I guess, said coal miners, even though we're not coal miners anymore, wouldn't take this stuff. So I'm not going to either. Something, and now they're the worst.
Right. So I'll end with this very heartwarming headline. feel-good story from The Hill. Pentagon goes on offense versus GOP on vaccine mandates. I don't know if they're bringing the tanks and the big guns, but there they are. Ooh. Pentagon is on the offense after a cascade of Republican lawmakers have pushed back over COVID-19 vaccine mandate. Okay, because basically the states are saying, we won't impose this on our National Guard. But so far the Supreme Court is saying, yeah, you will.
Yeah, well, it's the National Guard. I know you all think of yourselves as state things, but it's a National Guard, and the nation says take the vaccine. So they lose.
So the Biden administration, Pentagon chief, allowed each military service to set its own deadlines for compliance, with most falling on dates between November and December. And the furthest out was the Army National Guard and Reserve's June 30th cutoff.
Right. You only have to be vaccinated
June 30th is
a
long way away. And making things more complicated, even while under Title 32 Guard troops are paid with federal dollars, a fact that means they must follow the mandate regardless of duty status, according to defense officials. But the states argue until they're called upon, then they're mine.
Okay, well...
If you call them up, they're yours. So if you want to get them vaccinated by your mandate, you have to call them up first.
Fine. I deploy you to a vaccine center there.
Right. So we'll see what happens.
Okay.
So, it's one of those things where the Pentagon says this is what you have to do. And once again, it's Republican states that are fighting this.
Because they hate the Pentagon
Republican
so much.
states are trying to get their National Guard killed. I think that it's up to Democrats to make that clear.
Support the troops. Yeah. Don't support their health. So, it's very interesting. That.
And we'll see if Omicron changes things. And, of course, we'll see what the Supremes do, because you never know with them. That's it for me for this week.
Okay.
And I will talk to you on Monday.
Yes.
And, this is not a practice to get off the air. It's one of those, do not try this at home unless you want to do a podcast.
Right. Okay. And in which case, try it out on us first. Send us a tape, and we'll play it, and then you have the podcast. Poof.
There you go.
All right. Thanks, Greg. All right. I need to go call up the National Guard. I'll be right back. Hello, National Guard.
Well, while you call the National Guard, I'll end this call so that they don't have to hear all the noise.
All right. Take care. Have a good
All right.
visit.
I hope the trip goes well.
Good luck with it.
Let's hope our tests are negative.
Right.
That.
That first.
Yeah.
Okay. No second line. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Woo! All right, where to go? I don't know. There's so much happening here today. Other things to read and share and lots of stuff. Let's jump in at the political science level again. Two things appearing in the Twitter timeline today because they appeared in the newspapers, one of which Greg covered, but perhaps we should read through it a little bit, and I put the two of them together. The one was the clip of that AP story, Slow Motion Insurrection, How GOP Seizes Election Power. I feel like we've been over this ground, but it needs to be repeated and reiterated as often as possible, just so that it sinks in, unlike the comet thing. That and a New York Times piece on the Supreme Court, which together, because we were talking about them rigging the elections system, they're talking about setting things up not only for Donald Trump to take power again, if possible, or any other Republican nominee for that matter, but to do the same for themselves in all elective offices, Congress, state and local legislatures, as well as executive bodies. But that would take care of the executive and legislative branches. But the fact that the same thing is going on in the judiciary, I mean, like I was saying this morning, what's the big deal? It's only 3 out of 3 branches, right? Let's jump in and see exactly what's going on in our 3 branches. I guess we'll start with the AP story only because Greg covered it already, so we don't have to exactly read through the entirety of it, although I haven't highlighted pieces of it yet, so maybe that's the way to do it. It's my only method available to me, doing it live. Slow motion insurrection, how GOP seizes election power. I do think this is ground we've been over, but once again, reading from the work of someone who's put this together as supposedly put this together as coherent thought will help us. Nicholas Riccardi is the person whose thoughts they are. That's the author of the piece. Let's jump right in here. In the weeks leading up to the deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, a handful of Americans, well-known politicians, obscure local bureaucrats, etc., stood up to block then-President Donald Trump's unprecedented attempt to overturn a free and fair vote of the American people. Oh, by the way, yeah, this came to mind. Well, this is always on my mind. But yesterday, what were we... pre-show, I was looking at... Oh, yes, right. More people nitpicking on the idea of... Oh, yeah, well, I'll have to scroll back and find the thing. But more people nitpicking on the idea of pushback on the notion of whether or not, as Republicans like to frame it at election time, parents should control what's being taught in the classroom versus parents having a say in what's being taught in the classroom. And this, as I recall, was coming up in reaction to the debate. All right, I'm scrolling back because I'm pretty sure I'll find it here somewhere. But it's going to take me back to pre-show yesterday. If I can find this thing. Right. Well, maybe I'll jump back to it after a little bit more reading from AP. But now I'm committed so far into scrolling to find everything so I can credit everybody properly. But anyway, the debate was raging over whether or not the extent to which parents should have a say in what's happening. Here we go. Okay. Was it this? No. All right. At any rate, the difference between having a say in what goes on in the classroom versus controlling what goes on in the classroom was at the crux of the debate. And eventually I will find the tweets I was thinking of that prompted this debate. But that's not actually super important just now. But I keep thinking of the difference between having a say and controlling. I viewed it as a chance to talk again about the Electoral College. Like, would we say, for instance, that the majority of American voters had a say in the outcome of the election or controlled the outcome of the election? I guess you'd have to say they had a say in it and that they voted. We always only have a say in it because we have the Electoral College, right? But in this case, of course, a majority was pretty clear in saying that in 2016, Hillary Clinton ought to have been elected. And on the other hand, the Electoral College said the other thing. So they didn't get to control exactly what happened, but they had a say in what happened. I don't know, this will all make perhaps more sense later on if I can find the tweet. What I should do for now is go back to the AP article. Right, so well-known politicians and obscure local bureaucrats stood up to block then-President Trump's unprecedented attempt to overturn a free and fair vote of the American people. That's why I was reminded of it. The American people, by a majority of voters said Hillary Clinton ought to be the president. The Electoral College said otherwise. So we had a say in things, but control lay in the hands of the Electoral College, just as parents can have a say in things, but control is in the hands of the Board of Education, policymakers, teachers, etc. I don't know why it was such a weird, raging debate yesterday, but it was because it involved CRT, so it got real hot. Anyway, in battleground states and beyond, in the year since, Trump-aligned Republicans have worked to clear the path for next time. In battleground states and beyond, Republicans are taking hold of the once overlooked machinery of elections. I feel badly about having that included, only because, I know what they're talking about. They're talking about the obscure jobs that people don't really necessarily pay much attention to, whether it's elections officials in the county level or even secretaries of state at the statewide level. Like, that's a statewide office. right? That's important. But yeah, people pretty much ignore that. They statewide vote for governor. I'll vote for my local, for state legislators or whatever. But whether if they elect attorneys general or vote for secretaries of state, etc., people kind of ignore that. They'll vote their party allegiance, perhaps, but they don't pay a great deal of attention to these things. And I understand that's what's motivating that statement. Republicans are taking hold of once overlooked machinery of elections. But if you're old enough, you might remember that, say, post-2004 presidential election, for a brief moment, secretaries of state at the statewide level were in focus, and Democrats and Republicans alike said these are actually important offices. We got to pay attention to this stuff. It matters who's there. And you'll be thinking, as I am, of Ohio, and wasn't Michael Steele? Was it Michael Steele? Is that where he came to us from? Was the Ohio Secretary of State, and it made a difference again in what defines a vote and whose vote gets counted, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like we lost that focus, but it was there. So it's not that it's once overlooked. I mean, I guess twice overlooked, because it was once overlooked prior to 2004. Then it wasn't overlooked. Then it got overlooked again. So you see what I wanted to add to this. While the effort is incomplete and uneven, outside experts on democracy and Democrats are sounding alarms, warning that the United States is witnessing a, quote, slow-motion insurrection, with a better chance of success than Trump's failed power grab last year. They point to a mounting list of evidence. Several candidates who deny Trump's loss are running for offices that could have a key role in the election of the president in 2024. In Michigan, the Republican Party is restocking members of obscure local boards that could block approval of an election. In Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the GOP-controlled legislatures are backing open-ended, quote, reviews of the 2020 election, modeled on a deeply flawed look back in Arizona. The efforts are poised to fuel disinformation and anger about the 2020 results for years to come. And I guess that's an accurate statement, in that if they're modeled on what happened in Arizona, they're modeled after something that failed, that didn't find any of the fraud they said they were looking for. But it did happen to succeed anyway in fueling disinformation and anger. So if that's what they're looking for, then they'll be fine. Like the rest of the world says, but they failed. Why would you model on them? But did they? Because they weren't really supposed to find fraud. They were just supposed to make people angry. And we have succeeded in that. All this comes as the Republican Party has become more aligned behind Trump, who has made denial of the 2020 results a litmus test for his support. Trump has praised the January 6 rioters and backed primaries aimed at purging lawmakers who have crossed him. 16 GOP governors have signed laws making it more difficult to vote. And Associated Press, NORC, NORC Center for Public Affairs Research, I don't know what NORC is, but Greg probably does. Their American Affairs, where were we? Center for Public Affairs Research poll showed that 2/3 of Republicans do not believe Democrat Joe Biden was legitimately elected as president. That's not good either. The result, experts say, is that another baseless challenge to an election has become more likely, not less. It's not clear that the Republican Party is willing to accept defeat anymore, said Stephen Levitsky, a Harvard political scientist and co-author of the book How Democracies Die. The party itself has become an anti-democratic force. Lots of writing about this. Not very much action, but lots of writing. It starts with writing, so okay. American democracy has been flawed and manipulated by both parties. Got it both sides. Since its inception. Millions of Americans, black people, women, Native Americans, and others have been excluded from the process. True. Both Republicans and Democrats have written laws rigging the rules in their favor. They have. I think it's been a quantum difference, but, I guess at the highest, from the highest view, both sides have done those things. I'm sure there have been some egregious examples from Democrats too, but for instance, gerrymandering a state's legislative lines under Democratic control happens. They definitely have done it. They definitely still do it. And I think they probably should continue to still do it because there's no other solution really, that I have seen work yet. But anyway, that would be an example of rewriting laws, rigging the rules in their favor. Of course, it would also, by the way, Republicans would say, well, this is rewriting the rules, rigging the rules in your favor, allowing for more no excuse absentee balloting or drop boxes or things like that, or the state picking up the expense for voter registration drives in areas where voter registration is low, which also tend to be, let's say, demographically, they very often would work out to the advantage of Democrats to register more people there. But you also are able to say, well, this is the place where, one, we clearly need it because registration is low, and two, where access to registration drives is pretty low because the resources that we've invested there are pretty low. Plus, of course, there's the rigging of elections very often by Republicans who rig things in other ways, but that would be equivalent and not out of keeping necessarily with this level of manipulation. That is, say, making sure that only very few voting machines, and busted-ass ones at that, are available in areas that may vote heavily Democratic because, let's say, they're urban, as they might say, in their composition. Wink, wink, we know what that means. But on the other hand, there's a quantum difference between, well, look, everybody does gerrymandering. Everybody works around the margins on how easy is it to vote and who can vote and under what circumstances. That's true. But there's also a quantum difference, like I say, between that and saying, well, from now on, if the Secretary of State is Republican, the Secretary of State is unilaterally empowered to invalidate the results of an election if that person says there's good reason to. And that's it, just leaving it at that. And saying, well, no, you can't invalidate. And once the voting is done, you got to count what you got. But we want to expand the universe of who you can count. I mean, it is partisan, or could be considered partisan, to say we want to expand the universe of who gets to vote. But there's also another way of looking at it, which is that's a democratic principle, small d, democratic principle. More people should have a voice in how they're governed. So we're for that. Now, if it happens to help us, great. As opposed to saying, no, fewer people should have a say in what goes on. And if it happens to help us as Republicans, great. Now, it's really, there's a big difference. More people voting is a gooder thing, I'll use that word, fake word, than less people voting. And that doesn't necessarily depend on, that should be the viewpoint of everyone. More people having more say in governance is a better thing, but there's a party dedicated to the opposite of that, and that's kind of weird and disconcerting. They used to not want to admit that, but now they do. And that's odd. All right. So, yeah, both Republicans and Democrats have written laws rigging the rules in their favor, but they've been more egregious and more naked lately from Republicans, I would say. This time, experts argue, is different. See, I argue that too, but I'm not an expert. Never in the country's modern history has a major party sought to turn the administration of elections into an explicitly partisan act. You usually search for an excuse that has, that comports with the desired partisan outcome. They've stopped looking for excuses in the Republican Party. Republicans who sound alarms are struggling to be heard by their own party. Representatives Liz Cheney of Wyoming and Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, members of the House Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection, are often dismissed as party apostates. I don't know how you actually... why does that word elude me? It's a common one. Anyway, others have cast the election denialism as little more than a distraction. But some local officials, the people closest to the process and its fragility, are pleading for change. At a recent news conference in Wisconsin, Kathleen Bernier, she may say Bernier, I'm not sure, a GOP state senator and former election clerk, denounced her party's efforts to seize control of the election process. These made-up things that people do to jazz up the base is just despicable, and I don't believe any elected legislator should play that game, said Bernier. Bernier's view is not shared by the majority of the Republicans who control the state legislature in Wisconsin, or any other state for that matter. One of a handful of states that Biden carried, but Trump wrongly claims he won. In early 2021, Wisconsin Republicans ordered their Legislative Audit Bureau to review the 2020 election. That review found no significant fraud. Last month, an investigation by the conservative Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty came to the same conclusion. Weird. Both sides of the aisle are coming to the same conclusion, and yet one side of the aisle, the one that ordered the investigation and conducted it, still says, no, we should just be awarded the win. By the way, the people who oppose participation trophies just want the trophy given to them without competition. That seems weird. Well, anyway, still, many Republicans are convinced that something went wrong. Yeah, you lost. But that's actually things going right. They point to how the nonpartisan Wisconsin Elections Commission, which the GOP-led legislature and then Republican governor created 8 years ago to run the state's elections, hoping to rig things in their favor, but it didn't work out for some reason, like appointing John Paul Stevens to the Supreme Court for Republicans, for instance. Anyway, that body changed guidance for local elections officers to make voting easier during the pandemic because, they thought that the Republican Party that was responsible for their appointment and creation wanted more people to have more say in their government because blah, 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 freedom, USA, individual choice, you can't tell me what to do without my consent. They figured, they still believe in political science as we understand it here in America, and more people having more voice in what they do is a good thing, and we will just convince them that Republican views are the right ones. And if we don't, we don't. But the point at bottom is that everyone should get to stand up for their individual freedoms. And now they find out, no, our definition of that has changed too. When I say individual freedoms, I mean mine, not yours. It is, of course, gimmitarianism at heart. Anyway, that's led to a struggle for control of elections between the state legislature and this commission that the Republicans in that legislature created in the first place. It's not coming out right. They're not doing the things we wanted them to do. We thought they understood it when we winked at them that this meant rig elections for Republicans. And they were like, we'll be fair. Well, we're not having any more of that. We feel we need to get this straight for people to believe we have integrity, said GOP Senator Alberta Darling, who represents the conservative suburbs north of Milwaukee. We're not just trying to change the election with Trump. We're trying to dig into the next election and change irregularities, like losing. Republicans are also remaking the way elections are run in other states. In Georgia, an election bill signed this year by the GOP governor gave the Republican-controlled General Assembly new powers over the state Board of Elections, which controls its local counterparts. I've already told you what's going on in Georgia. That you'll be reminded right here, I think. The law is being used to launch a review of operations in solidly Democratic Fulton County, the home of most of Atlanta, which could lead to a state takeover. The legislature also passed measures allowing local officials to remove Democrats from elections boards in 6 other counties. You remember I told you that story not that long ago, that it's already happening, right? They passed a law that says, the state legislature can dive into counties where Democrats have won election to or otherwise control the elections boards and say, this is, by our definition, a low-performing county. There's something wrong with the performance of this county. We therefore say, all of you Democrats who were elected to this election board, you're not elected anymore. Poof, you're gone, and you're going to be replaced by Republicans that we name. And people say, but how dare you? We voted. You can't just come in here and say, the election is undone, Republicans won. Well, actually, yes, we can, because look at what it says here in this law that we just passed. It says we can do that. But that should be beyond your power, like constitutionally somehow. Well, as it turns out, it's not, or no court has said so yet anyway, so we're doing it. And by the way, I don't know if you knew this, but just as an extra irony, just to make you extra mad about the fact that we're screwing you over, Do you remember who the governor of Georgia is? I don't remember his name. Brian Kemp. You remember his name. And you remember what Brian Kemp used to do before he was governor of Georgia? When he was elected, he was the Secretary of State. He had Brad Raffensperger's job. And then weirdly, oddly, through some weird, crazy coincidence, that everybody thought, well, maybe there's nothing all that weird about it. He is a Republican, and Georgia is a pretty Republican state. At least we think so. It's traditionally been the case, of late. It's been a conservative state, I mean, it depends on how long your view of history is. But lately, they elect Republicans statewide. And so, no weirdness here. Another Republican has just been elected statewide. Now, there was some accusations of shenanigans of sorts from the Democratic candidate for governor, Stacey Abrams, who thought, well, I'm not so sure that the majority of voting Georgians really preferred, or those who wanted to vote anyway, were really preferred Kemp over me. But there were these weird purges, somewhat controversial purges of the voting rolls that happened right before. And as it turns out, a lot of the people who would have been most motivated to cast their ballots for Stacey Abrams were purged from the rolls. And those people who were most interested, perhaps, we felt, statistically speaking, in voting for Brian Kemp, while they remained on the rolls. And then, lo and behold, Brian Kemp won. Oh, and lo and behold, the person who made the decision about who to purge and who not to purge was Brian Kemp. That does seem odd, doesn't it? And so, but, on the other hand, well, a long string of victories for Republicans statewide in Georgia. So maybe it just is another one like this. But Stacey Abrams thought, it's different. We've registered a lot of people to vote here that were not traditionally registered before, and I think this might change the voice of the majority in Georgia. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe things are changing. Maybe they just weren't ready yet. However, it is worth noting that in the very next set of statewide elections in Georgia, Democrats won these seats for the first time in a long time. They started voting, and then all of a sudden, poof, they won 2 Senate seats. And you say, well, what happened a couple of years ago when we had that contest between Abrams and Kemp? Kemp was in control of what gets to count as a vote, and he won. And although he was still in charge of things, generally speaking, because he was governor, he wasn't the one pulling the trigger on who gets to count and who doesn't. Brad Raffensperger was. Then they held the vote. 2 senators elected that were Democrats, and the electoral votes from Georgia go to the Democrat for the first time in a while. That is odd. It makes me think, did we count that right? Did we do the right thing and count the right way and define things the right way when we were doing the governor's election 2 years earlier? Maybe not. It is weird now. Now it makes me more concerned that the guy who was in charge of saying how to count what's a vote and what's not is the guy who was standing for election and then won. Okay, enough of that diversion. Republicans, as we said, are also remaking the way elections are run in other states, and they continue to do this. In Georgia, an election bill signed by the governor, who we just told you about how he became governor, gave Republican-controlled General Assembly new powers over the State Board of Elections, which controls its local counterparts. They're using that to just say, you're not an elected elections official here anymore. You're a Democrat, and that means you're low performing. You're out. We replace you with Republicans. In Pennsylvania, the GOP-controlled legislature is undertaking a review of the presidential election, subpoenaing voter information that Democrats contend is an unprecedented intrusion into voter privacy. Basically, they're wanting to remove the secret ballot element of elections so that they can I want to find out for sure that everybody really voted the way they did. So only way in order to do that, we're going to have to strip away the protections and ask people directly, who'd you vote for? Meanwhile, Trump supporters are signing up for local election jobs in droves. One pastor who attended the January 6th rally at the nation's capital recently won a race to become an election judge overseeing voting in a rural part of Lancaster County. It'll be up to him to say you're allowed to vote and you're not. And, well, if you're just a strict gimmitarian How do you think that's going to come out? In Michigan, the GOP has focused on the state's county boards of canvassers. The little-known committee's power was briefly in the spotlight in November of 2020 when Trump urged the two Republican members of the board overseeing Wayne County, home to Democratic bastion Detroit, to vote to block certification of the election. I think we all remember that. After one of the Republican members defied Trump, local Republicans replaced her with Robert Boyd, who told the Detroit Free Press that he would not have certified Biden's win last year. Boyd did not return a call for comment. A similar swap, replacing a traditional Republican with one who parroted Trump's election lies, occurred in Macomb County, the state's third most populous county. The Detroit News in October reported that Republicans had replaced the members of boards of canvassers in 8 of Michigan's 11 most populous counties. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Whew, okay, I got eyes on everything here. But let me see. I want to jump back into the AP article and finish it. I thought I would finish it a lot sooner, but, I got distracted. And I got distracted right at the beginning of the thing. You know how this stuff goes. All right, so lots of things happening in different states around the country. We just finished up with Michigan. And, we haven't finished with Michigan. I mean, we stopped on Michigan. The state's top election official, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, warned the movement to cast doubt on the 2020 election has now turned their eyes to changing the people who were in positions of authority and protected 2020. That's the bottom line. The people who actually stood up and said, we're the guardrails here for whatever reason. Even Brad Raffensperger at the time decided to do this and said, no, we're not going to go along with the request to simply hand you the election and just redefine what a vote means. I mean, that's essentially what Trump was asking for when he was saying, well, Brad, I need you to find 11,000 votes. I need you, in other words, to redefine the ballots that you've gotten here and maybe even redefine numbers themselves and say, why don't you just say that there were 11,000 something more votes for me than there really were, and leave it at that. I mean, it would be nice if there were actually pieces of paper behind those votes. Maybe you need to generate those pieces of paper, but you need to say that 11,000 more people voted for me, or that 11,000 more people who voted for Biden should have their votes invalidated. That might be the easier path than generating new ballots that you say are from legitimate voters. Why don't you just say that 11,000 something Democratic votes are hereby canceled because they colored outside the lines, or maybe they have the same name as a dead person, or maybe there's no reason whatsoever, but just say it and those people will never find out that you invalidated their votes, or even if you do, they'll be, they're possibly, why don't we pick on very poor people who won't be able to hire lawyers to protect their rights or even show up at court in time to object to having their vote invalidated because they got to be at work in the middle of a pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. Or wholesale, we could just say any vote that was cast in one of these drop boxes is somehow suspect and therefore canceled. They would try anything. But that's what he meant by finding him 11,000 votes. Find me an excuse for either adding 11,000 votes to my total or subtracting 11,000 votes from Biden's total. And if you can do it in a way that, at least looks like it might be legal, ish to enough Republicans, then that'll be fine. Even if, a normal person would look at that and say, no, that's highway robbery. You can't do that. It's outrageous. If we can get Republican legislators to agree to it, some of them will probably say, this isn't really what I meant to do when I went into public service. And we'll take care of those guys. We'll say, listen, either you do this or Donald Trump will come out and see to it that you're primaried and kicked out of office. And he can do it. He's much more powerful than you are. We'll kick you out. Well, all right. I guess I'll go along with it. I'll just be one of, 100 and something votes here in the Georgia legislature for it, and no one will single me out. And that's how you get away with this stuff. All right, a little bit more in here. As I mentioned, Jocelyn Benson, Secretary of State, saying they're replacing the people who did the right thing with people who said, I'll do the wrong thing. That includes Benson. Multiple Republicans have lined up to challenge her, including Christina Caramo, spelled with a K in both cases, a community college professor who alleged fraud in the 2020 elections and contended that the January 6th attackers were actually Antifa activists trying to frame Trump supporters. Still believes this, apparently. Trump has been clear about his intentions. He is seeking to oust statewide officials, and locals for that matter, who stood in his way and replace them with his allies. We have Secretary of States that did not do the right thing for the American people. Trump, who has endorsed Caramo, whatever, told the Associated Press this month. The most prominent Trump push is in Georgia, where the former president is backing U.S. Representative Jody Hice, who voted against Biden's Electoral College victory on January 6th in a primary race against the Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. He rejected Trump's pleas to, quote, find enough votes to declare him the winner. Trump also encouraged former U.S. Representative David Perdue to challenge Governor Brian Kemp in the GOP primary. Kemp turned down Trump's entreaties to declare him the victor in the 2020 election, which is odd because he was willing to do it for himself, except it's not really odd at all if you think of things in Gimbitarian terms, strictly Gimbitarian terms. Screw you, I got mine. Oh, okay. Well, now that makes more sense. In Nevada, multiple lawsuits seeking to overturn Biden's victory were thrown out by judges. A suit aimed at overturning his congressional loss was filed by Jim Marchant, a former GOP state lawmaker, now running to be Secretary of State, of course, and it too was dismissed. And so, by the way, they're losing in courts, which is weird. So they'll take care of that later, and you'll see how in the next article that we read. The current Republican Secretary of State, Barbara Segavsky, maybe. Anyway, you figure it out. Who is term limited, by the way, found there was no significant fraud in the contests. What do you know? Marchant says he's not just seeking to become a Trump enabler, though he was endorsed by Trump in his congressional bid. I've been fighting this since before he came along, Marchant said of Trump. All we want is fair and transparent elections. But by all accounts, you're getting them, so you're just losing them. In Pennsylvania, Republican State Senator Doug Mastriano, who organized buses of Trump supporters for Trump's rally near the White House on January 6th, has signaled he's running for governor. In Arizona, State Representative Mark Fincham's bid to be Secretary of State has unnerved many Republicans, given that he hosted a day-long hearing in November 2020 that featured Trump advisor Rudy Giuliani, former news anchor Carrie Lake, also with a K, Carrie. There's a K in Lake too, but you can see it doesn't come first. Who repeats Trump's elections falsehoods, is running to succeed Republican Governor Doug Ducey, who stood up to Trump's election year pressure and is barred from another term. You don't even have to fight to oust him. Elsewhere in Arizona, Maricopa County Recorder Stephen Richer, who defended his office against the conspiratorial election review, has started a political committee to provide financial support to Republicans who tell the truth about the election. But he's realistic about the persistence of the myth of a stolen election within his party's base. Right now, Richer said, the incentive structure seems to be strongly in favor of doing the wrong thing. Next section here, high stakes races for governor. In Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Democratic governors have been a major impediment to the GOP's effort to overhaul elections, i.e. steal them. Most significantly, they have vetoed new rules that Democrats argue are aimed at making it harder for people of color to vote. Governors have a significant role in U.S. elections. They certify the winners in their states, clearing the way for the appointment of electoral college members. That raises fears that Trump-friendly governors could try to certify him, if he were to run in 2024 and be the GOP nominee, as the winner of their state's electoral votes, regardless of the vote count. Additionally, some Republicans argue that state legislatures can name their own electors regardless of what the vote tally says. I know that's their claim. It's not true and not a real reading of what the Constitution says, but again, the next article will help us fix that. But yes, that rests on the claim that state legislatures are granted the power of deciding how to appoint their members of the Electoral College. They can appoint them themselves, or they can choose to have a coin toss. We've said this before. Or they can choose to have an election, and the election winner in that state will get the electoral votes. That's the way they always went with it before, because they were all about, we're for like freedom and democracy and all that stuff. Then they started losing, and now they say, no, we're not for that. We're for gimmitarianism. What we say goes in this state. Now, they do have the power ahead of time to say this time around in 2024, the legislature will vote to determine who gets the electoral college votes. They can do that ahead of time. What they can't do is say, we'll have an election. And then if they lose the election, say, no, wait a minute. We change our mind. We'll do it ourselves. You can't do things that way. Now, can you? I mean, you can. You can't, in the sense that it's not fair. No one believes that it should be, by all rights, unconstitutional. But if the people who decide what's constitutional and unconstitutional say we're gimmitarians, so it's constitutional, then poof, it's constitutional. You were pretty wrong about that. Sorry. Why? It's weird that you had both an election and a vote in the legislature, but what are you going to do? The robed guys say it's okay. So it's okay. Automatically. It's one of the few places where what we say goes really still stands in this country. It is interesting, by the way, that the legislature, I guess the legislature could say we will simply, we could empower the Speaker of the House in our state legislature to name the electors. Maybe they would do that. But it's interesting, though, that they probably won't go that route. Instead, what are they going to allow themselves to do? They are restricting to themselves the power to name the electors, but that's constitutionally okay. How will they decide who the electors are and when they're legitimate? And the answer is, isn't it weird? They're going to vote. Those guys get to vote, just not you guys. We don't believe that you guys can. How come no one ever alleges voter fraud in the state legislature? Well, it's open and you can see it's not a secret ballot and everybody's name is listed and you say out loud how you're going to vote. Now, how do I know you reported that correctly? How do I know you recorded it correctly? How do I know that you don't just stand there and say, I vote for truth, freedom, justice, and the American way, but the machine records that you voted for communism? I don't know. Right? I guess ultimately I really do know when you can figure it out and everything, but what if you just stand there and say you can't know? There's probably another piece that we need to add to this puzzle before we close out the reading for today. Now I've really given myself a challenge. I better get started again. All right. So, Republicans say that state legislatures can name their own electors regardless of what the vote tally says. But Democrats have had little success in laying out the stakes in these races. It's difficult for voters to believe the system could be vulnerable, said Daniel Squadron of the States Project, a Democratic group that tries to win state legislatures. The most motivated voters in America today are those who think the 2020 election was stolen, he said. Acknowledging this is afoot requires such a leap from any core American value system that many of us have lived through, or any of us have lived through. I guess that's a good point, although I think it was poorly put. Maybe we could make it clearer, or maybe I've just messed it up. But acknowledging that the Republicans are doing what they're doing requires acknowledging that everything we know about how stuff works and what the consent of the governed means and how we vote and what a vote is and who counts it and how and what counts and what doesn't and all of these things. Like, you can't just say the other guy won. You can't say guy B won if guy A got more votes. Well, you can. Now, traditionally, this is done by saying, well, we'll redefine what votes are so that it looks like guy, in the end, if you vote with your left hand, it doesn't count. And more left-handed people voted for guy B, and guy B has more total votes. But then you take away all the left-handed votes, and after you do that, guy A wins. I mean, you can do that. And that's traditionally the way they've done it. What's surprising to people is, one, that could happen. That's shocking enough. What? No. But if you explain it to enough people, usually they say, well, okay, I see. They shouldn't do that, though. I know they shouldn't. They shouldn't redefine those things, especially after the fact. But they shouldn't redefine them ahead of the fact either. It's not fair. Everyone, people are people, and they get to vote whether they're left-handed or not, right? Yeah, and we thought everybody was dedicated to that principle, and it turned out that they're not. But there's another way you can do this too, which is guy B got more votes. But watch this. I say guy A is the winner anyway. You do, but based on what? Based on nothing. But I say it. And me and the rest of the state legislature guys who are on Trump's team say, what the hell? I mean, the numbers are the numbers, true, but what if I just say, so what? The other guy won. Well, that definitely can't happen. Well, in fact, it can. And if the guys you're asking are the 9 robed black robe things, well, only one of them's black, see. But anyway, the robes are all black. And if you ask those 9, and 5 or more of them say, I know that we were all taught that there's an order to the numerals, and that 3 is more than 2. But we also learned that there's no appeal from the Supreme Court. And today, we say 2 is more than 3. And it's odd, and I know that whole thing is weird. Now, I like to that, I would say, that is an interesting ruling. How many of you say that? 5? Well, guess what? 4 is more than 5. So you lose. No, we don't lose. Well, unfortunately, like, that's as legitimate a conclusion as anything else. But I don't have a robe. So you don't listen to me and you listen to them. But you, in the robes, just told me that in this case, 2 is more than 3. So it must follow by logic that 4 is more than 5. It might, if you cared about what logic was. We don't. So case closed. And AP guys say, I don't know, man. The robed guy said, it's all wrong. I'd like to say how wrong it is in this article, but I do have to acknowledge at the end that that's what they said, and we learned that what they say goes. So that's kind of tough to swallow and hard to explain to people. I agree. So now, I said that there were other pieces to this. The next, I guess the next most important one would be sharing this New York Times piece from Linda Greenhouse. Do we have the Supreme Court we deserve? It's kind of an oblique angle at coming at this, but the elements of what we need are in there. Let's see if I can get through it. Linda Greenhouse writes, when I left the daily Supreme Court beat back in 2008, like a million years ago, the Week in Review, as the Times Sunday Review section was then called, invited me to offer some reflections on nearly 30 years of writing about the court. It should have been a capitalized court for that, but okay, it isn't. Its cases and its members. The long essay ran under the headline, 2,691 decisions, a number based on an editor's calculation of how many decisions the court had issued during my time on the beat. I ended it with an observation about the vital dialogue between the court and the country. This was my conclusion. The court is in Americans' collective hands. We shape it. It reflects us. At any given time, we may not have the Supreme Court we want, we may not have the Supreme Court we need, but we have, most likely, the Supreme Court we deserve. What the hell does that mean? Well, let's listen. A friend who recently came upon that article challenged me. Do you still think we have the Supreme Court we deserve? She asked. Actually, sadly, my answer now is no. And what? It's only been 12, 13, 14 years since then. It's not that I think the country simply deserves a Supreme Court that happens to agree with me, I was finding plenty to disagree with back in 2008. Justice Samuel Alito had taken Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's place in early 2006, wrenching the closely divided court to the right. In June of 2007, Justice Stephen Breyer, during an impassioned oral dissent in a highly charged case on what measures public school systems can take to maintain racial diversity, lamented that, quote, "It is not often in the law that so few have so quickly changed so much." Nonetheless, Justices John Paul Stevens, Anthony Kennedy, and David Souter were still on the bench in 2008, proving every day that to be a Republican-nominated Supreme Court justice was not necessarily to be a hand-picked conservative spear carrier in the country's culture wars. The three were chosen by Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, respectively. It had not occurred to anyone then that a hostile Senate in 2016 might keep a president's Supreme Court nomination bottled up for 11 months without a hearing, nor that a supine Senate would do a subsequent president's bidding 4 years later and bludgeon a nomination through to confirmation while millions of Americans were already casting early ballots for president. In short, we are a different place now than we were in 2008, in a different place, and we are a different place as well. And the current term finds the court in a danger zone as a willing and willful participant in a war for the soul of the country. Last term's cavalier treatment in a case from Arizona of what remains of the Voting Rights Act sent a frightening signal about whether the court can be counted on to protect democracy from the Republican-led assault now taking place before our eyes, the one we just talked about. We now have justices apparently untroubled by process and precedent, let alone appearances. Let's not forget that 2 of Donald Trump's 3 appointments arrived under debatable circumstances, with Justice Neil Gorsuch taking a seat in 2017 it was Barack Obama's to fill, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett being jammed through to confirmation late in 2020. And that leaves out the one that I thought she would include in one of the 2, Brett Kavanaugh. One might suppose that the supercharged conservative majority might proceed with some caution, if not humility, before projecting its agenda on a wary country that never signed up for it. You might think so because, of course, New York Times reporters have famously forever said, there are some differences, but, now, of course, everyone knows that you'll have to govern from the center. You have to tack back to the center. You can't be arrogant about your agenda, Democrats. But Republicans, well, you might say that about them, but then you realize, oh no, actually they're not going to. And we're not going to say they're doing you wrong here. We're just going to say, gosh, that's bold. Anyway, after all, of the 6 Republican-appointed justices, only 3 were named by a president who won a majority of the popular vote. Justice Clarence Thomas by George H.W. Bush, and Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Alito by George W. Bush in his second term, but he only won the second term because he had been awarded the first term when he lost that popular vote. We should point that out. And given the small state, red state tilt of the Senate, it's not surprising that the senators whose votes provided the narrow margins for confirming the 3 Trump-chosen justices represent less than half of the country's population. Yet, what we see from the court is not humility, but, to put it politely, a lack of situational awareness. Why be polite, though? Polls consistently show that a majority of Americans oppose overturning Roe v. Wade, something the court has given every indication that it will do within the next 6 months. By the way, to put it politely, the reason we put it politely is the thing we read at the end of the previous AP article about how Republicans are seizing control of the elections, right? It's difficult for voters to believe the system could be vulnerable, and they, are resisting learning the facts about how they're actually operating. And so we still put things politely instead of doing things as, say, Armando does by saying the court is a political actor. It always has been, and now it's just more explicit than ever. And people are beginning to realize it, and few people are waking up to that. But we just still generally try to put things as politely as possible, but there's no point in doing so. Anyway, as we said, 3/4 of respondents in one recent poll said the abortion decision should be left to women and their doctors. This was also a view of the majority of the public in a Gallup poll released, by the way, in the summer of 1972, shortly before the court issued its decision in Roe hasn't changed. Hundreds of pages of briefings in the Mississippi abortion case that was argued this month failed to unearth a single reason other than because we want to and because we can for overturning the 49-year-old precedent that the court reaffirmed in crucial respects 2 decades later in the carefully considered compromise that was the Casey decision. All 5 members of the Casey majority were also, by the way, appointed by Republican presidents, just as are all of those who stand on the verge of repudiating the same precedent today. It's now 4 months and counting since the court permitted the obviously unconstitutional Texas vigilante law known as Senate Bill 8 to all but shut down abortion in that state, a situation the 5-4 majority has refused to rectify. Instead, the court made a show of expediting the SB 8 argument in early November and then issued a Potemkin village-like opinion that resulted only in pushing a resolution further into an unknown future. But note the way she says it here, obviously unconstitutional. And yet, it hasn't been declared unconstitutional because, 5 robes say, it's obvious to everyone else, but we're just not going to do it. The justices' responses to arguments this month suggested that a majority will soon force Maine, against the will of its legislature, to subsidize tuition for parents living in school districts without high schools who send their children to parochial schools. Roughly half of the state's school districts are too small to sustain a high school. To satisfy the state constitution's guarantee of a free K-12 education, the state pays tuition at private schools but excludes those offering an explicitly sectarian education. Where a federal appeals court, in upholding the exclusion, saw a principled distinction, the conservative justices saw only anti-religious discrimination. As the court proceeds down its current path, will there be a reckoning of some sort? I'm not smart enough to know the answer, but a prescient essay that Russell Wheeler of the Brookings Institution published in 2019 suggests that political scientists' long-held view of the role of the Supreme Court in American politics will be profoundly upended. Mr. Wheeler, Brookings' longtime specialist in the federal courts, recalled a famous 1957 article in which the Yale political scientist Robert Dahl observed that because of regular presidential appointments, policy views dominant in the court are never for long out of line with the policy views dominant among the lawmaking majorities of the United States. It was a comforting observation that anchored the court's legitimacy in democratic theory, even though they're not democratically elected, right? Mr. Dahl, who died in 2014, at 98, perhaps chose not to envision a president with the muscle, the will, and the opportunity to place young partisans on the court. In other words, aided by the Constitution's gift of lifetime tenure, to capture the court for the next generation and freeze in place a legacy of the American people never chose. Is this the Supreme Court we deserve? It is not. In late 2009, David Shipley, the editor of what was then called the op-ed page, invited me to write an opinion column every 2 weeks centered on the Supreme Court. He left the Times for Bloomberg News the following year, and we never actually met, but I remain in his debt. Writing roughly 26 columns a year for the past 12 years has given me not only a platform, but a discipline, a privileged and rare second act in journalism. I've felt a deep connection not only to my subject, but also to my readers and, of course, to the newspaper where I began, fresh out of college, as an intern for the storied political columnist James Reston. I guess this is more about her relationship with the Times than anything else. And as a matter of fact, I might as well stop here since time is limited and jump to the one other article just to mention what I think is a third piece of what is going on here. And all I've got from this is the video, which I won't be able to play for you now, but basically the tweet from David Pepper, whose name I may have even come up a little earlier in today's show. I think Greg may have mentioned him. At any rate, he puts what's going on in this segment on CNN about redistricting in Ohio. And what has happened here, as the video says, is it's gotten too little attention, but Discovery, in a court case about redistricting, uncovered that the Ohio Republican election riggers were using two sets of books essentially. Basically what they did was this, right? Just as we had discussed, them just redefining everything and just plain lying, or just saying 4 is more than 5, as the court might say, or we're going to redefine what a vote means, or just simply find 11,000 votes. They're redistricting. We all know that they want to redistrict on a partisan basis and gerrymander the state and give the Republicans the greatest advantage in Congress that they possibly can. Send the most Republicans to Congress. But everybody knows, they're all anti-gerrymandering. Everybody's supposed to acknowledge at heart that that's an unfair thing to do. But only Democrats actually acknowledge it, and then they give away the power to do it when they win. But at any rate, so what does the GOP do in Ohio? Well, they need to reassure their Republican members that they are doing everything they can to keep them in power and shoring up their seats and sending as many Republicans to Congress as possible. But they also need to maintain the facade of fairness. So they just keep 2 sets of books. The real data by which they're actually drawing the districts and saying, well, we're going to design this a 60% Republican district for you, and a 65% Republican district for you, and a 55% Republican district for you. But they instead, well, that's unfair, right? So what we'll do is we'll tell the public, oh no, they're all much closer than that. There's a 51, there's a 50-50, there's a 52, there's even a 56, but there was nothing we could do about that. And the other one is actually 48-52 Republican favoring Democrats. But it's all baloney. They just make up the thing. They just say, well, this is, how do we know what the partisan makeup of those districts is? We never imagined, once again, that they would simply lie about it and use 2 sets of books. But of course they would. How could we not anticipate that?
From networksradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
And by the way, why not do that? Because what's the penalty for doing that? You would think, oh, well, you get your head chopped off, right? You spend the rest of your life in jail. No, there's no penalty, because we never thought to put a penalty thing in there because, well, that's just not done. We don't need to worry about that. Or if we do, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Well, we're at it.